Good morning, boys and girls. Guess what we get to talk about today? The Black Death. Yeah, it seems kind of appropriate that the day I'm recording this, Halloween, we're going to kill the Middle Ages and kill off maybe about a third to a half of the European population ish. But before we get there, let's talk about the world of 1300. So, the world of 1300 is a very different one from the world of the Dark Ages. We actually have a problem of overpopulation, not underpopulation. Remember that with the peak of the Roman Empire, the European population numbered about 50 million people. Now, by about 1300, you have the European population numbering about 80 million people. So this presents a whole nother set of problems. We've talked about agrarian advances, but around 1300, we start sort of outpacing the rate of technological advancement. Now we actually have problems of trying to keep all of these peasants and city dwellers fed. So we get some famines. Also, we have the spread of warfare, yes, more warfare, and of course, with overpopulation comes lots and lots of disease. So, not only do you have disease just because there's more people and therefore more people to infect, but you also have the problem of urbanization. You have lots and lots of people moving to cities, and remember that cities don't really form, no one wakes up in the morning and says, I really think I should build London today. Cities tend to emerge organically. And so you don't really have, except in a few very exceptional cases, urban planning. So basically, you have houses and buildings built on top of each other. And the consequence of that is that, well, you have people living in very close proximity. And of course, even closer proximity because oftentimes cities had to be protected by walls. So you couldn't really sprawl out as much. But also, just because you have people living in very close proximity to one another, they would often just, dump their waste into the streets or whatever was close by. Yeah, perfume must have been a great line of business to get into during the Middle Ages. It seems appropriate that probably the most iconic figure of the Middle Ages, the knight, um, actually sort of recedes in importance during this time period. That doesn't mean that the knight was somehow worthless, but it does mean that the knight just wasn't as effective as he used to be, and really wasn't effective, especially when you consider that knights were really darn expensive. They took a lot of money to maintain because they had their armor, they had their personal servants and retainers, and also they took years and years to train. I'm not going to say that they become decorative exactly. That might be a little bit of an exaggeration, but they do become gradually less effective as the Middle Ages go on. And there's a few reasons for that. Firstly, you have dedicated units that are basically mercenary companies that formed during the Middle Ages, and their task is to basically take down knights. These aren't your medieval peasants with like wooden sword, or not wooden sword, that would be kind of dumb, wouldn't it? Wooden spear or wooden shield. These are soldiers that are relatively armored. They fight on foot, and they have weapons that were especially effective against horses and armor. These would be, for example, halberdiers and pikemen, where some of these pikemen would have pikes that were anywhere from like 15 to 20 feet long. And also, you have specialized units of crossbow soldiers that fire armor piercing crossbow bolts that have pretty extreme ranges. So you have the growth of these mercenary armies, like I said, that were trained to take down these knights. Now, again, knights still did pretty well, but it meant that you couldn't just automatically win a battle by showing up with more knights than the other guy. Things became a lot more complicated. Along with mercenaries, you just generally see the growth of professional armies. What this basically means is that these are armies that are paid by the state, usually by the central government, the monarch, and that these are armies that receive training, and they're not fighting because the Lord has basically called them away to fight for a few weeks. They're fighting because this is their job. Now, one of the things that made medieval warfare sometimes indecisive is, I've mentioned that in general, peasants were wholly ineffective against knights, but a lot of times armies would be very reluctant to go against each other because if you had a bad battle, not only does that lead to the death of a lot of your troops, remember, these feudal armies are made up of your peasants. So basically, not only do you lose your armies, you also lose the people who are your farmers, the people who basically make your land and your life somewhat profitable. So there's a lot of reluctance to necessarily go head-to-head in big bloody battles, which is a lot of times why medieval warfare revolved around sieges or, what we call, there's a fancy French term for it but that I forget, but basically it means these sort of long distance raids against enemy farmland and that sort of thing. As bloody as warfare could be in the Middle Ages, generally there was a lot of reluctance to necessarily go and fight the other guy. But with professional armies, they're paid to fight. If you lose them, you're not losing farmers. So there's, to a certain extent, a little bit more incentive for armies to go head to head. As you might imagine, these professional armies tended to fight a lot better than feudal armies. So this is going to mean that once the monarch gets control of these professional armies, it's going to sort of further alienate or decrease the power of these feudal lords. Now, some of those professional armies are emerging with new types of weaponry. We'll talk about it in just a little bit. But obviously the big one here is going to be cannons and gunpowder-based weapons. This is also one of the things that leads to knights becoming somewhat irrelevant because, suits of armor make a lot of sense when you basically can reliably block almost all projectiles and almost all close quarters attacks with them. But basically, you have, a knight oftentimes would have to train from adolescence up to adulthood. There's a lot of time and investment in that knight. On the other hand, if you got a guy with a hand cannon or eventually a musket, you can basically learn how to fire one of those puppies in about 15 minutes, maybe a little bit longer because the early models were a little bit tricky to handle. But still, you have a knight, this elite warrior that has spent 10 to 20 years training to become what they are, and then you have Devon, who picks his nose all the time, but still is competent at firing a musket. Now, obviously, Devon probably isn't going to hit that knight, right? Because Devon's an idiot. He's a filthy peasant. But there's going to be 10 Devons for one Sir Lancelot. And probably one of those bullets is going to hit. So, in other words, armies kind of get bigger as well. They revolve less around these elite warriors on horseback, the knights, and more around armies that can employ massive amounts of firepower. Also, the cannon basically revolutionizes one other thing. Remember that feudalism is strong throughout Europe, partially because every royal government has to decide whether going after obnoxious nobles is worth their time. Because a noble has a personal army, but they also typically have some kind of fortification, like a keep or even an entire castle. And they can always hole up there for a little bit. And sieges took a very long time and were pretty costly on all sides. So sieges could sometimes take years. Or when you get cannons, maybe they could take just like a couple of days or sometimes even a couple of hours. So, new armies with cannons could make short work of these medieval castles. And basically, this is one of the things that makes the feudal system sort of go away. So, we're not just talking about the end of the knight, we're also sort of talking about the decline of feudalism as a whole. One thing I'll also mention, though, is that the knights don't exactly disappear. The knight is still an extremely capable warrior, but they have to sort of figure out what their role is going to be in this new sort of technological and social order. So what happens is, obviously knights can no longer be the one-man army tank space marine things that they were in the early part of the Middle Ages. That's impossible now. And of course, if you send your knights to charge a bunch of guys with muskets or pikes or whatever, you're going to lose a huge quantity of your best warriors. So eventually what happens, and we're looking sort of at the 15, 16, and 1700s here, is that knights sort of put away their armor and instead become officers. So these are guys who are effective not because they can single-handedly take down like 10 of the enemy, but instead they're capable because of their knowledge, their training, and their ability to lead other people. So the knights don't go away exactly, they just kind of evolve. So let's talk a little bit about the Hundred Years' War, which is kind of an example of all the things that we've been talking about here. So the Hundred Years' War is, as the name suggests, a century-long or more conflict between the Kingdom of England and the Kingdom of France. Now, the King of England, remember, well, the kings of England, they were all descended from the Normans who invaded England in 1066. Now, remember, the Normans were originally Vikings who were allowed to settle in northern France by the King of France. And then William the Conqueror gets a claim to the throne of England, and so he makes this little road trip to England, fights the Battle of Hastings, and becomes the King of England. Now, the English monarchy and the English nobility, they're basically all Normans, which means they're descended from these French-speaking Viking people. So it means that in the Kingdom of England, ironically, almost all the nobles, and including the monarch, spoke French. In fact, you don't really have a King of England that speaks English as their first language, I think, until about the 1400s. I think King Henry the Fourth, maybe, and at least King Henry the Fifth was one. Okay, so the King of England actually is a big. Not only do they speak French, but they also are big landowners in France. So they have Normandy. They also have what's called the Duchy of Aquitaine, which is basically most of southwestern France. And so I'm going to ballpark it and say that the Kingdom of England, or rather the King of England, owns about 1/4 to 1/3 of French territory. And technically, maybe humiliatingly, the King of England was the vassal of the King of France. Because remember, the King of England was also the Duke of Normandy, and Normandy was considered part of the French crown, as was Aquitaine. Excuse me. So technically, it's one of those situations where you have this extremely powerful monarch, the King of England, who actually has to submit to a monarch with a lot less power, the King of France. France is a very powerful nation, but the King of France himself is not. The French monarchy is a little bit more decentralized than England's monarchy. And we kind of get a sense for that When there's actually a civil war in France. Basically, you have this semi-independent state called Burgundy, which goes to war with the King of France. Um, at that point, England under King Edward III sees an opportunity. And so the English army basically invades France. Now, on paper, the French should win, but again, the French are in a civil war, and so things are a little bit more complicated. That being said, the French still have a lot of knights. But issue here is that the Kingdom of England, it doesn't have as many knights. What they do have, though, is they have a large number of soldiers that know how to use what's called the English longbow. Now, the English longbow isn't like one of those piddly little bows that peasants used. So the English longbow is a 6-foot bow made of yew wood. It required about 150 to 160 pounds of draw strength to fire one of these things. So in order to use these longbows, it required a massive amount of physical strength. Now, King Edward III understood that these weapons were incredibly effective, and a lot of times those arrows fired from the longbows could penetrate armor. So Edward III orders all English people to basically start training with the longbow. And it gets to such a point that on Sundays, the King of England basically forbids every major activity, sporting event, whatever, except archery contests. So there are several pitched battles during the Hundred Years' War where the French fight these armies of English longbowmen. Probably the most famous is the Battle of Agincourt, partially because William Shakespeare makes an entire play on it called Henry V. So in Agincourt, what happens is that you get a French army of about 30,000 troops, including around 10,000 knights. It's pretty beefy. The English army is less than half that. And of course, they don't have anywhere near that number of knights. And so basically what happens is the French army charges, and once again, the French army sort of loses track or sight of the fact that these longbows can basically hit targets from 300 yards away, and a decent longbowman can basically fire 5 to 6 times a minute. So basically, imagine thousands of longbowmen shooting at you. You are trying to attack them, and you start from 3 football fields away, and each longbowman has, I don't know, 15 shots or so to basically hit you. By the way, it also wasn't helped that the French army dismounted and decided to charge on foot. They also got stuck in the mud. It was a mess. So here's the thing with Agincourt. I don't go into details on a lot of battles, but sometimes it's necessary, not just because you have battles that decide entire campaigns or wars, but sometimes battles have immediate consequences beyond that. So basically, all the French knights get wiped out, killed, or captured. So remember that if the knights get wiped out, you're not only losing your best soldiers, you're also losing the people that keep society running. They're the people that keep the peasants in line. They're oftentimes your administrators, the people who maintain estates. And also, it's not just the knights that are going down, because you have feudal lords also leading these knights into battle, and so they go down too. So basically, a lot of France's nobility gets kind of wiped out. If you've ever heard of Joan of Arc, the story of a peasant girl who supposedly talks to God, who leads the French army to victory in the Hundred Years' War. One of the reasons that Joan of Arc is able to become basically the leader of the French army during the Hundred Years' War eventually is because, well, a lot of France's military leadership just gets absolutely destroyed. So, as you can kind of imagine, you have this entire social class that basically gets gutted. And so, one of the things that it teaches you is that with this emphasis on knights leading forces into battle and fighting on the front lines, if you have a bad battle, not only would you lose all your best soldiers, you would lose the people that make society work. You could basically destroy your entire social system in the course of an afternoon, which, well, it's a lot. Fortunately, we get to talk about happier subjects now. The Black Death. Okay, so, whew, the Black Death is something that appears recurrently throughout world history. Last time we talked about the Black Death, it had just ripped through the Eastern Roman Empire during the reign of Justinian. And also remember the bubonic plague spreads in Athens and other parts of Greece during the Peloponnesian War. It always seems to arrive at the most inconvenient time, admittedly. So it says that it starts in China and travels along the Silk Road. That's true. So there's a lot of debate as to, how Europe gets officially introduced to it. But probably the best explanation, or at least the most interesting explanation, is that it was carried by the Mongols. Now, the Mongols were obviously trying to push into Europe. They had arrived in Eastern Europe, had sort of carved up Kievan Rus and that whole area. The Mongols at this point were trying to besiege the city of Kaffa, which is on the Crimean Peninsula right here. And remember that that part of Ukraine was strategically important because of the importance of food supply. And so you had ships from all across Europe sail through the Black Sea to basically get extra food, grain, etc. One of those ships was, or one of the groups that did this, one of the city-states that did this was the city-state of Genoa. Now, the Mongols were besieging the city of Kaffa. The Mongols, let's just say that they had they were kind of ADHD and really didn't want to spend a lot of time besieging the city. And so they decided, or they happened upon an idea. Their soldiers were infected by the bubonic plague, and of course they were suffering lots of losses as a consequence. So somebody gets the idea to start flinging dead bodies who have died from the plague over the walls of Kaffa and into the city. And lo and behold, what happens? The defenders of Kaffa start losing a lot of people because of the plague, and eventually the Mongols are able to take the city. But before they do that, a Genoese ship is able to escape. And it sails through the Aegean Sea, through the Mediterranean, and eventually gets back to Genoa. And of course, lo and behold, what happens? Well, they're carrying plague with them. Specifically, what the carriers of the plague tend to be rats, or rather the fleas on rats. And so the fleas, because it's the Middle Ages and everyone's filthy, hop from the rats to people and spread the disease that way. So it arrives in 1347. This isn't immediately clear at the time, but eventually it starts spreading pretty dramatically. So what's complicating things is that there are actually three types of bubonic plague. There is regular old-fashioned bubonic plague called Yersinia pestis. Then there is pneumonic plague, and pneumonic plague is actually an airborne variant. Now, regular bubonic plague is, at least around this time period, it kills roughly 50% of the population, or 50% of all people infected. Pneumonic plague has like a 90 to a 95% mortality rate. It's, absolutely horrific. Then there's the more rare septicemic plague, which is, I understand, I mean, I'm not an epidemiologist or anything, but I think that's only transferable from, blood to blood, essentially. So you're dealing with actually three different outbreaks of plague at the same time. It's worth pointing out that Europeans don't have a concept of germ theory yet. In fact, most Europeans believe that disease is transmitted through a foul wind called miasma. So there's not that sense, and I mean, how could there be the sense that disease is actually spread by these tiny little things that are invisible that you can't see, but they're always there, called microbes. So there are a few success stories, most notably the city of Milan, where basically as soon as people started showing signs or symptoms of plague, they basically shoved them in one location, shut the doors, and locked them in. This kills basically the initial plague victims, but that, I'm not condoning that or condemning that, by the way, but it basically means that the city of Milan more or less is saved. There are a couple of areas as well that are sort of spared the worst of it, but in general, roughly a third to a half of the European population gets killed. So, as you can imagine, the impact is going to be significant. So, first thing, you have to imagine what would happen if half of everybody you know just sort of disappears. Well, as you can kind of imagine, if you're looking at it from the perspective of monarchs or nobles, it means like half their workforce has disappeared. They're making half as much money. From the perspective of peasants, however, it's actually like if they survive, it's actually not that bad because they're getting, extra bargaining power. Lords can't treat peasants all that crappy anymore, because now peasants have gone from being like part of this surplus population of people and considered expendable to actually being considered like critical. So you get massive amounts of inheritance that's being transferred, and so you have large quantities of wealthier peasants. That being said, European demography, the European population is changed forever because of this. So the European population doesn't really get back to the point that it was in 1300 until around the 1600s. Excuse me. So, massive demographic changes, massive class changes, because, of course, if you survive the bubonic plague, this was actually a pretty decent opportunity for social mobility. It also causes some intense sort of reflection, because as you can kind of imagine, during this time period, you can't really plan for the future. You have no idea what the future is going to bring. From the perspective of people of the Middle Ages, people were just randomly dying all the time. And it's hard to really make sense of that. So in a world where you can't really plan for anything, where it seems like death is omnipresent and around every corner, the question is, how do you cope? And people cope in different ways, but the one way that people often cope is through, hedonism, basically. This idea of live, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we may die. That definitely emerges during the bubonic plague. Now, one thing that you see in medieval art during this time period is the danse macabre. This is basically the appearance of a skeleton in the midst of like celebrations and revelry. And the idea here is to say, well, no matter what's going on, no matter how much things have no matter how much people are celebrating, death is around every corner. there are some also pretty significant religious impacts. So generally, one force that helps during these types of crises is, of course, organized religion, right? And this is the case with almost any crisis. You have large numbers of people that turn to organized religion to kind of help make sense of things that seem like completely unsensible. So you do see that, but also the problem is, one, the church isn't exactly presenting a united front. There's actually a period called the Avignon Papacy, where basically there are not one, but two popes, one in Avignon, one in Rome, and they both excommunicate each other. And basically there's no certainty as to, which pope is the official pope. So right at the time when we need the church to kind of come together, it's actually more disorganized than ever before. Also, almost every person of faith has to ask themselves, or comes across a situation where they ask themselves, why do bad things happen to good people? Or why does God allow terrible things to happen? Now, that's maybe a question that you can avoid when the worst thing that happens to you is you stub your toe. But when 50% of the population dies, when 50% of the people that you know die, that kind of throws that question right in your face. And you have to figure out how you can explain that. So oftentimes in history, people will answer that question for themselves, find some kind of explanation that satisfies them, and in fact, their faith is sort of restored. Oftentimes, however, you see the opposite effect, that people sort of lose their faith because they're unable to answer that question. It kind of depends upon the individual, right? So a lot of people lose the same connection that they have to the church. Finally, let's go ahead and compare some of the art styles that you see during this time period. This is like the period right before the Renaissance. And we are beginning to see the development of realistic artistic styles, not quite the same as what you'll see in the Renaissance. Note how basically baby Jesus here has a 40-year-old man head, but still we're sort of edging in that direction. Okay, that is the end of the Middle Ages. If you want, answer the review question. How does the medieval world decline towards the end of the High Middle Ages? If your answer does not contain the bubonic plague, then what is wrong with you?